Imagine a disease so deadly that it wiped out nearly half of an entire country's population in just 4 years. A disease so terrifying that people believed it was the end of the world. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But this was real. This was the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, a catastrophic plague swept across Europe, leaving unimaginable destruction in its wake. Known as the Black Death, this wasn't just a disease. It was a historical turning point that reshaped societies, economies, and even the way people thought about life and death. And England. It was one of the hardest hit regions. In this video, we're diving deep into the chilling story of the Black Death and its impact on England. You'll learn how it arrived, the chaos it caused, and how it changed England forever. From abandoned villages to shocking social upheavals, this is a tale of survival, despair, and unexpected consequences. So, buckle up. This is history like you've never heard it before. So, where did this nightmare begin? The Black Death is believed to have originated in Central Asia, around the steppes, a vast grassy region perfect for rodents, which played a key role in spreading the disease. From there, it traveled along the Silk Road, the bustling trade network connecting east and west. By 1347, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where it hitched a ride on merchant ships heading to Europe. And just like that, the plague arrived in Italy, spreading like wildfire across the continent. But how did it move so fast? Well, the Black Death had 2 main accomplices, rats and fleas. Infected rats carried the disease, and fleas that bit those rats became carriers themselves. When these fleas bit humans, the plague entered their bloodstream, but it didn't stop there. The disease also spread through the air, especially in its more deadly forms, making it nearly impossible to contain. Crowded cities, poor sanitation, and a lack of medical knowledge created the perfect storm for a pandemic. Now let's talk about the symptoms, and trust me, they were horrifying. Victims would develop painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes turned black, which is where the name Black Death comes from. Other symptoms included high fever, chills, vomiting, and severe muscle pain. Most victims died within a week of showing symptoms. The mortality rate was staggering, up to 60% of those infected. Imagine losing more than half of everyone you know in a matter of months. That was the reality of the Black Death. And here's the scariest part. The Black Death wasn't just one disease. It came in 3 forms. The most common was the bubonic plague, which caused those infamous buboes. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread through coughing, making it even more contagious. Finally, the septicemic plague infected the bloodstream, causing tissue to die and turn black. All 3 were deadly, but the pneumonic and septicemic forms were almost always fatal. By 1348, the Black Death had already ravaged much of Europe, and it was only a matter of time before it reached England. The plague arrived in the summer of that year, likely through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Ships carrying goods and infected rats docked there, unknowingly bringing death to England's shores. From there, it spread like a shadow, creeping into towns, villages, and cities with terrifying speed. At first, people had no idea what they were dealing with. The disease was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Panic set in as entire families fell ill and died within days. The government, led by King Edward III, was just as clueless. They tried to maintain order, but what could they do against an invisible enemy? Churches were overwhelmed with the dead, and mass graves became a grim necessity. People turned to prayers, superstitions, and even bizarre remedies like burning aromatic herbs or drinking potions made from crushed emeralds. But nothing worked. The speed of the plague's spread was staggering. By 1349, it had reached London, the heart of England, where crowded streets and poor sanitation made it a breeding ground for the disease. From there it moved north, leaving devastation in its wake. Villages were wiped out entirely, earning the nickname Lost Villages of England. In some places, there weren't enough people left to bury the dead. Fields went unplowed, livestock roamed untended, and the economy teetered on the brink of collapse. By 1351, it's estimated that nearly half of England's population, around 2 million people, had perished. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it shattered the very fabric of society. Let's talk numbers, because they're shocking. By the time the Black Death subsided in 1351, it's estimated that England lost between 40% to 60% of its population. That's roughly 2 million people gone. To put that into perspective, imagine half of everyone you know, your family, friends, neighbors, just wiped out. Entire communities vanished. In some areas, the death toll was so high that villages were abandoned completely, earning the haunting name, the Lost Villages of England. The scale of loss was unimaginable, and it left a gaping hole in the country's social and economic fabric. But the impact wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. Survivors were traumatized. They'd watched loved ones die horrible deaths, often helpless to do anything about it. Fear was everywhere. People avoided each other, terrified that even a conversation could spread the disease. Trust in institutions, like the church and the government, eroded. After all, if God couldn't protect them from the plague, what was the point of faith? And if the king couldn't stop the suffering, what was the point of loyalty? This crisis of faith and authority planted seeds of doubt that would grow for generations. And then there was the societal collapse. With so many dead, the labor force was decimated. Fields lay fallow because there weren't enough workers to tend them. Livestock roamed untended. Entire industries ground to a halt. The feudal system, which had been the backbone of medieval society, began to crumble. Lords who relied on peasant labor suddenly found themselves powerless as workers realized their value and demanded higher wages. It was a complete upheaval of the social order. Abandoned villages dotted the countryside, eerie reminders of the lives and communities that once thrived there. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed a way of life. With nearly half of England's population gone, the economic fallout was immediate and severe. Farms, which were the backbone of the medieval economy, were hit hardest. Fields that once produced wheat, barley, and other crops now lay empty because there simply weren't enough people to work them. Livestock roamed untended, and entire harvests were lost. Trade suffered, too. Markets that once buzzed with activity became ghost towns. Goods couldn't be transported because there weren't enough laborers or merchants to move them. The economy, already fragile, was on the brink of collapse. But here's where things get interesting. The massive loss of life created an unexpected opportunity for the survivors, especially peasants. With so few workers left, Laborers were in high demand. For the first time, peasants had leverage. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. If a lord refused, they could simply move to another village where their skills were needed. This shift in power was revolutionary. The feudal system, which had kept peasants tied to the land and at the mercy of their lords, began to crumble. It was the beginning of the end for serfdom in England. The long-term effects of the Black Death were profound. The rise in wages and the decline of feudalism led to a more fluid society. Peasants could now aspire to better lives, and the rigid class structure started to loosen. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, began renting out land instead of relying on forced labor. This shift laid the groundwork for a more modern, market-based economy. Over time, England would recover, but it would never be the same. The Black Death didn't just change the population. It changed the very way people lived, worked, and thought about their place in the world. The Black Death didn't just destroy lives. It shattered beliefs. For centuries, the Church had been the center of people's lives, offering comfort, guidance, and the promise of salvation. But when the plague hit, prayers went unanswered. Priests died alongside their congregations, and entire monasteries were wiped out. People began to question, why would God allow such suffering? Was this divine punishment, or was the Church powerless to stop it? This crisis of faith left many disillusioned and searching for answers. Out of this despair emerged extreme movements, like the Flagellants. These were groups of people who believed the plague was God's wrath, and that they could atone for humanity's sins by punishing themselves. They would publicly whip themselves, hoping to earn divine mercy. But the Church, already struggling to maintain its authority, saw them as a threat. Meanwhile, ordinary people began to question the Church's wealth and corruption. Why were bishops living in luxury while their flocks suffered? This growing skepticism planted the seeds for future religious reforms, like the Protestant Reformation over a century later. The Black Death also left its mark on art and culture. One of the most striking examples is the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. This was a popular theme in art and literature that depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, priests, to their graves. It was a reminder that death was the great equalizer, coming for everyone, regardless of status. This morbid fascination with death reflected the trauma of the plague and how it reshaped people's worldview. Literature, too, began to explore themes of mortality, suffering, and the fragility of life. The Black Death didn't just change how people lived. It changed how they thought, created, and expressed themselves. After the devastation of the Black Death, England faced the monumental task of rebuilding. With so many lives lost, the country had to adapt quickly. Abandoned villages were repopulated, though some were left as eerie reminders of the past. Fields that had lain fallow were slowly brought back to life, and trade routes began to reopen. But this wasn't just a return to the old ways. It was the start of something new. The sheer scale of the loss forced England to rethink how its society and economy functioned. One of the most significant changes was the decline of feudalism. Before the plague, peasants were tied to the land, working for lords in exchange for protection. But with so few workers left, peasants suddenly had bargaining power. They demanded higher wages and better conditions, and many lords had no choice but to agree. This shift weakened the feudal system and gave rise to a more fluid social structure. Serfdom began to disappear, and a new class of free laborers emerged. It was the beginning of a more modern, market-driven economy. Believe it or not, the Black Death also sparked some positive changes. With fewer people to work the land, there was a push for innovation in agriculture. Farmers began experimenting with new techniques and tools to make their work more efficient. The labor shortage also led to the rise of skilled trades, as people sought specialized work that paid better. And culturally, the trauma of the plague inspired a wave of creativity. Art, literature, and even architecture began to reflect a deeper understanding of human mortality and resilience. In a strange way, the Black Death forced England to evolve, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern world. So let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. The Black Death was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, wiping out nearly half of England's population between 1347 and 1351. It arrived through trade routes, spread rapidly, and left behind a trail of devastation. Abandoned villages, broken families, and a shattered economy. But it also sparked profound changes. The decline of feudalism, the rise of a more modern economy, and even cultural shifts in art and literature all trace their roots back to this catastrophic event. The Black Death didn't just kill, it transformed England in ways that still echo today. Here's something to think about. What would our world look like if a disaster of this scale happened today? Would we rise to the challenge, or would we crumble under the pressure? The Black Death reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, humanity has an incredible capacity to adapt, rebuild, and even thrive. It's a story of resilience, one that's as relevant now as it was over 600 years ago. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves history. Let me know in the comments, what part of the Black Death story shocked or surprised you the most? And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.